extensible choices in interactive fiction. So I said my background is as a freelance game programmer, and I've built one interactive storytelling system in Unity, which I'll be showing off at the end. But I'll be honest that most of my knowledge on this topic is really more secondhand from just reading extensively on it. And speaking of which, a source that I want to give some credit to on this talk is Chris Crawford. He was a game designer in the 1980s, had a couple of hits back then. He founded the Game Developers Conference, which there's like hundreds and hundreds of videos out on now. And actually, one of his talks is one of the most viewed, and I would argue one of the best videos on the Game Developers Conference series. If you search for Chris Crawford Dragon Speech, it's basically giving an impassioned talk that video games have the potential to be an art form on the same level of sophistication as television and books and movies, but that they've been at the time, and you would argue still today, falling well short of that goal. He's written several books, including The Art of Computer Game Design, which is available as a free online PDF. Is he defines interactivity as a process where two actors alternately listen, think, and speak. So if you're having a conversation, someone says something, I hear it, I process it in some way, and then I say something back that's based off of what they said, and then they do the same to me. If any of those three parts are lacking in either participant, then the conversation is crappy. It's not really a conversation at all. So I spent roughly 20 years on a failed Storytron project. I say failed because by his own account, no one used it and he shut the project down. This was essentially an attempt to create a engine for creating story worlds that met his very high standards of what interactive fiction could be. But it got overwhelmed by the project, and even when he published it, it wasn't really usable. More recently, he's published a interactive fiction called Le Mort d'Arthur. All right, so then going on to the meat of actual storytelling things, start with some ideas that I consider to be story adjacent. As they're not necessarily bad, but just that they're not really interactive storytelling. They're kind of something nearby, like adds flavor and so on. And probably the most notable of these is the string of pearls pattern for storytelling in games. This is where you alternate between interactive gameplay and a non-interactive cutscene. So let's say you're running around a first-person shooter in Halo or something like that, and you can go anywhere you want in the level, you can use any number of strategies, and then you get to some certain checkpoint and the game stops, and then there's a cutscene where you just like watch a short pre-scripted movie. And that has really no bearing on what you did during the game. And then after that, you go back to the game. And that's good for what it is. I think the main value of that approach is that the storytelling aspects of it, the little cutscenes and so on, add a lot of context and emotional impact and overall flavor to the gameplay, but the game really does nothing for the story. You could take the same video clips, string them back to back, maybe a few screenshots for what happens in between, and narratively you'd get pretty much the same effect. But the gameplay does benefit from it, so it's not a bad strategy. But I kind of analogize it to like the relationship between candy and candy wrappers. The wrapper makes the candy more presentable, prevents dirt and grit from getting on it, but the candy does nothing for the wrapper. You could put a ball of wax in there, it'd be the same thing. And really using that analogy of the conversation as listening and thinking and speaking from both parts, it needs to be mutual for it to really be interactive storytelling. If one's kind of benefiting the other and the other's not going back, that's just a different thing. Another thing I would call story adjacent is implied narrative. So this is like if you're in a game world and you're jumping around on platforms, or it's a first-person shooter or anything else. And the goal of the game is to defeat the enemies, to find objects scattered around, to solve puzzles, your typical game stuff. but around you, there's like ruins of ancient civilizations or like artifacts that you interact with. And you could have the same game experience as just like gray boxes and, very programmer art kind of stuff. But the existence of things looking the way they do implies that something very interesting has happened in the past, or ongoing currently. And that just kind of adds an extra level of depth and flavor to the world. Although it can be, some players will just run past it and not notice all the things you painstakingly put in there. So again, though, that's not really something that you interact with. It adds to the game. It has storytelling like things to it. But I would call it story adjacent for that reason. And the third thing, and this I imagine a lot of people would probably disagree with me, but another thing I would call story adjacent is what's known as emergent narrative, sometimes referred to as procedurally generated stories. And one thing I'll note here is we use some procedural generation in Rogue Invader, the project that I work on is published. And essentially the way most procedural generation works, or at least most that is effective, is you have a set of slots where all the content goes. And then you have another set of things that can go into the slots. And they get mixed and matched. So the end result is you have like a massive number of possible combinations of things in slots. And that's great for building like gigantic worlds that go on endlessly. It's kind of how Minecraft works, so there's a little bit more to it. You could also have a smaller thing that's different every time. So when I was working on Rogue Invader, the levels used that pattern, and they weren't super long, but there was like a lot of different prefabs that got slotted into the various sections. And so each run time you played through the game was slightly different. So one thing you lose by translating design into this method or one thing that this method assumes is that all the parts are interchangeable. And that doesn't really work so well with conversation and dialogue and social interaction, because like in a good conversation, or a good story, everything's interrelated. There's like lots of connections. And so just treating, like if you were to take a book and slice it up into chapters and write a few extra chapters and then throw them into some random order or a random set of things, you would be very unlikely to get a good story that way. That's the essence of the problem. However, this can work if you are a little less expressive. Rather than like a book that is written a certain way, you have just general events. I dug a tunnel and then I came across this unexpected cave, and then there were monsters in the cave, but also some treasure, and then I had to avoid it. Like if you talk about it if you talk about a story in a more general sense, and you just think about it in terms of major events, those could be rearranged and still have something coherent, as long as most of the details happen in the player's mind. That's where they fill it in, and the coherence and expressiveness happens in the player, not in the game itself. And that's why I'm calling it story adjacent, because the story isn't really happening in the game. So some examples of emergent narrative, probably the best ones are things like Minecraft and Dwarf Fortress. People play those and have like lots of anecdotes to talk about, which are generally a lot more interesting to the person it happened to than it is to anyone they're talking to. Although as another kind of example, these ones are a lot more rare and I think deserve more exploration. Are games like Frostpunk and Papers, Please, which actually manage, despite using the emergent narrative approach, to have a really strong dramatic arc. And they do this by railroading the gameplay. So in Frostpunk, for example, it's a city building game under very harsh and getting worse environmental conditions. And the way the game plays, you have to make a lot of hard choices between, your civilization surviving while maintaining human values and like saving children and other things. And you also get very much pressured into making decisions that turn your society into like super authoritarian or religious zealotry. And it's a hard balance to pull. And so by the end of the game, pretty much no matter how you play it, unless you just lose, you get this arc that the designers intended. And it's actually they make for some really powerful stories using the emergent narrative, but it kind of takes away a lot of the freedom. But both of these versions lack the expressiveness that you would see in like a book or a movie. It's still events that the player strings together. So my overall point in all this is that freedom versus dramatic arc seem to be a trade-off. The more you have of one, the less you have of the other, assuming you're doing it well. If you do it poorly, you get neither. But if it's done well, then it's a trade-off. And then also the same goes for expressiveness versus interactivity. So there's a talk on GDC called Cursed Problems in Game Development, which is where I'm getting that term from the slide. And it's just saying that there are certain things that you just can't have both of without finding some kind of compromise. And these seem to be examples of that. Specifically, if you're trying to create an interactive story where the focus is on building social skills, like social interaction is like what the key skill is, as opposed to like hand-eye coordination or something. And the way the game comes about is through language. Now, I put it as an aside here that perhaps ChatGPT will change this, and we'll be able to have fully expressive, fully interactive stories that are personalized to every single person and are totally coherent. But by then, technology has advanced so far that all bets are off for everything. Now getting on to like actual interactive fiction techniques. And the core thing, which really everything else is based on, is branching. And this typically follows some kind of tree structure or state machine, because it doesn't have to be all linear. You can loop back or reconnect and so on. And in a branching, the story is punctuated by choices. Each choice creates a branch. Each branch leads to a different story. So therefore, the choices you make change what the story is. And you can kind of get a visual of what this looks like in this kind of graph, where each node is a thing that happens, bit of dialogue, and the arrows represent choices. This has some problems, very basic problems. The big one is combinatorial explosion. That is, with each branch, the total number of choices increases exponentially. And you can see this in this diagram right here. Right now, we've only made 3 choices, and we have like all these nodes here in this last one. And after not very many choices, this gets impossible to write. And not only is there a ton of quantity to write, the quality suffers as well because of narrative coherence. A story is a cohesive unit. The end depends on the beginning, depends on the middle, and they're all connected parts. And so, like, writing one good ending is hard, but getting multiple endings that fit the whole story, that's like, there's a quote that like a good ending is surprising yet inevitable, because everything built up to that. And so to have everything build up to 2 very different things is kind of a weird idea. So yeah, the amount goes up, and then the quality of making anything good also goes up. And where you can kind of see that second problem is comes up in one of the common solutions, which is early exit, where most branches lead to some ending, usually just losing the game, before they have a chance to multiply. So that way, it doesn't get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's just like 2 or 3 times longer than a regular story would be. The problem with this approach is dead end branches don't really feel like alternative endings. They're just lost states. The end result is that the game just ends up feeling linear. And, why bother making it interactive at all? There is some games, but it's a huge trade-off. The other common solution is convergence, where certain nodes are the same no matter what the player does, but the areas between them vary. So in this diagram here, you have a choice, and it leads to starting to branch out, starting to explode a little bit, but then they all converge on the same thing, and then it branches out again. So the total number of nodes never really gets too big, despite having lots of choices. The problem with this one is that by the time you're over in this third block, what happened in this first section really doesn't matter anymore because you're seeing the same thing no matter what. And so, and the point of interactive fiction is not to make choices, it's to make choices that matter, that shape the course of the story. And if they don't, players are going to figure that out and say, like, what the heck is this? Especially if they play it more than once. So now going on to some less common solutions that I think are a little bit more promising. One is delayed branching. So using that same diagram from before, at certain points, if you reach this node, it trips some variable that you don't see until much later. And I think the Walking Dead games did that in some way where like certain choices that you make, the character says like such and such will remember this, indicating that it'll become important later on. And this makes the previous pattern feel a lot less rigid because say if you're in this block, well, the choices that you made in the first block might still matter because they might still come up in the third. So it adds a little bit there. And another uncommon solution is the ramp structure, or which is basically means numeric variables rather than Booleans. So what that would mean is things like you make it certain, let's say you come across a magic looking well and then you drink from the well and you gain +1 strength. And then there are several other things that might give you +1 or -1 strength throughout the game. And then later you get to some major enemy character and then it checks what your strength is and sees if you are above or below some threshold. And that'll determine whether you win the fight or you lose it. This could also happen with reputation with NPCs. You make a certain dialogue choice and they like you more, they like you less. And that will affect what options you have talking to them going forward. The basic idea in all this narratively is that it's adding a level of indirection. Choices affect variables, and then variables control story direction rather than choices going directly to story direction. And this effectively allows for many different choices to control a single branch. And one analogy I give for this is like a multiple choice test where you have to get 8 out of 10 to pass. In terms of branching, there's pass, fail, one branch, but there's 10 or 20 or 100 questions. And every single one of those questions matters because they all add up to your final score. And I'd say this approach is relatively unexplored. A lot of games use it in small ways with like character reputations, but it's rarely like the core part of what controls the narrative. And I think it could be. So I think that's something to explore.
Do you think Fable is an example of that?
I have not played it, but my understanding of it is you gain good or negative alignment based on your choices.
Yeah.
And then certain things narratively happen depending on whether you're positively or negatively aligned. Yeah, that's exactly would be a ramp structure. And yeah, interesting that like by a very simple single dimensional use of that idea, like that's kind of like the core hook of the game, which, demonstrates both the potential and the value of exploring it more. So that was all like processing that happens in the game. Another angle on this is how the user interacts with the interactive fiction. And the first type is explicit options. So in this example here from my Game Jam project, which Aiden worked on also, you have a bit of text right here. This is narrative that just showed up that's happening. And then each of these gray boxes are choices you can make. You click on one of these and that's what you say in response. The downside of this is the choices are very limited. There's just as many as are presented, usually like 2 or 3, sometimes 4. The benefit is that these can be highly expressive. So you'll notice I put a fair bit of text into each of these options. Like you can respond back with just as much detail as is coming in. And that makes this approach very conversational and ideal for back and forth dialogue. Another type of input is the text parser. These were popular in very early video games, like pictured below, and where you type out words and phrases to control what your character does or what happens next. And this is highly expressive because you're writing out in words. And the choice appears unlimited because you could type anything, but this is a lie. Because 99.9999% of anything you write in there, the computer's just going to say, I don't know what that means, and just spit it back at you. And so really you don't have very many choices, and they're very set. The computer just isn't telling you what those are, and it requires the players to guess at valid words. One notorious example of it in some game was to solve a puzzle. There's this rock described on the ground, and you try to pick up the rock. Oh, I can't. You try to lift the rock. I can't. And then eventually you guess, pick up the stone. Oh, now you can. So most of the things I've been talking about are trade-offs. There's like use it for this, but not for that. This one's just bad. Don't do it.
Well, well, for something like GPT.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because then it would be like, oh, rock when you said stone.
Yeah, I'm treating GPT as its whole different category of stuff. But yes, in terms of what the interface to it would be like, yes, that would be a text parser, and it would be, you could actually use it in that way.
He's also selling cheat books. Marketing.
Oh yeah, that's true. I mean, there are a community of people who like games this way that's been kind of self-selected, and they kind of make that as part of the game, is trying to figure out what the prompts are. Another type of input is Chris Crawford uses the term inverse parser, which I think is a very fancy way of saying menus. And basically there's a set of slots for groups of related choices, and all options that you can select are necessarily valid because the designer put them in. The benefit of this is the amount of choices are very extensive because you have any number of combinations. Oh, by the way, as my understanding of what's happening in this diagram, this is from Chris Crawford's game, Sea Boots. Something like goat character will tell alien whatever this means about the horsey in exchange for alien telling the goat character whatever this means about pelican. So it's essentially a trade of information. And you can imagine, like, you could put any character in each of these slots. You could wouldn't necessarily have to trade information. Who you're talking about can change. So there's lots of options. The downside for it is, well, one, you kind of have to learn what everything is if it's using pictorial. But more deeply is that it has a very mechanical kind of feel to it, which makes it ideal for complicated interactions like trading, which is what's happening here. You can also use it for deduction, like in I can't think of any good examples of it, but I can imagine this would work really well for detective games, where you're trying to guess what the solution to the mystery is. And there's a problem if you just give a set of options, because then the players can kind of figure it out by context or just guessing. But if you have this kind of menu set up, then there's thousands upon thousands of possible answers. No one could possibly just guess it. They have to actually solve the mystery. But it's all available right at the beginning. And one last type of input, which I think deserves a lot more attention, is gameplay tracking. So my example from my childhood on this is Chrono Trigger. Really good game. And one of the very early scenes of the game, you're kind of wandering around this country fair. And you have a lot of just kind of low stakes interactions, like no major conflict is happening. You're just kind of hanging around. And one of those things that come up is this little girl comes up to you and asks you to help you find her cat. And the cat is like somewhere in the fair. And you can spend time going around looking for the cat and bring it back to the girl. Or you can just ignore it and just go about whatever else you're doing. And it doesn't really seem like it matters until a while later, your character goes on trial for having supposedly kidnapped this princess in the game. And then there's a series of things come up where they're analyzing your character to determine whether you're a guilty sort of person or whether you're an upstanding citizen. And one of the things that comes up is whether you helped this little girl. And in this case, on this example, the player must have ignored her. And so now is getting chastised for that in front of the trial. And all of this matters because it's actually using that ramp structure where each of these choices goes into some sort of number, and then jurors come out at the end of the trial and say whether you're guilty or innocent. And that determines whether your character is going to go to jail or not. Unfortunately, they then ruin it by using the convergence structure, where if you get found innocent, then a corrupt guard throws you in jail anyway. And even if you don't play the game multiple times, it's really obvious that you go to the same result no matter what you've done. And so it totally destroys the stakes on this example. But when you're in the trial and these things are coming up, like it's really cool. And one thing I'll note about it from a design perspective is gameplay tracking is going to be necessarily customized to the game. It's hard to imagine having like a plugin or a pattern that you just follow to get gameplay tracking. It's like really tying it close to what happens. And overall, I have not seen it in a whole lot of other games. So I think it deserves to be used more. Okay, so now just kind of talking about imagining applications. On one end of the scale, there's basic interactive fiction and visual novels. The benefit of this is they're very small scope and easy to create. You can focus totally on the interactivity and storytelling aspects, and you're able to use pretty much all of the techniques that I was talking about before, possibly not gameplay tracking or emergent narrative. Those might require stuff happening in a game. The downside is this is going to be going to have a narrower appeal. For one thing, visual novel type things are rather niche. They're not a game. They're also not a book or a movie. So like, who's really the audience? And there is one, but it is kind of niche. And also you have to deal with low expectations. Players have seen so much stuff with convergence and choices not really mattering even when the game says it does, that if you're going to make something where the choices really matter, you got to prove it and get them to expect something interesting happening behind the scenes. Otherwise, they'll just assume it's just reading things. On the other end, you can imagine open world games, which sound really awesome and I imagine are a dream for like a lot of active gamers. But the scope obviously is very massive. And one challenge with this is you're probably not going to have a single dramatic arc, but you can imagine a bunch of like smaller stories happening in parallel and then maybe get interconnected perhaps through the stories being like reflecting some larger thing that's happening narratively, or maybe each mini story affects the gameplay, such as like how much currency you have, your stats, whether characters are your allies or your enemies, what options you have in stores, and so on. But to create that kind of interplay between the game and the narrative. I think I'll skip over this slide. Basically, the point that I'm making here is just that imagining what a path would be from the very small visual novel to the very big open world RPG. And I can imagine some intermediate steps like a linear role-playing game where you bring in a loop between game and story, but it's like a single narrative. And then also maybe an open world interactive fiction where there's like multiple scenes that you could jump between and like a number of parallel stories that interconnect together, but no gameplay. That's kind of just speculative as to how to approach the big stuff gradually. Okay, so now some fun things here. I'll be talking about a game I worked on as the most recent game jam towards the end of January. It's called The Juice of Arthur. I'll provide a link at the end. And right here, I'm just going to show the elements in the Unity game engine for how this is put together and how you can use it. So there's a state machine dialogue system using scriptable objects. It's just these little assets that you can create in Unity. You can see some of them down here on the left side. And each node has a bit of narrative that someone says, so you can see it out here, and then a number of responses that are available. And each one of those responses is a node that you can go to, and it'll display the narrative there. So right here, we see like everyone wishes to speak to you, and that's what shows up here. And your options are, what do you mean, or whatevs, and those are here, and each of those will go to new things. So some other things that happen in the nodes are events and occasions. So so you can see here, we're in this node, and there's like a occasions list, cast changes, and so on. So events are just miscellaneous effects. So when we've reached a particular node, we might set a game object active or do something else in the scene. That's kind of just a fallback for just miscellaneous stuff that is not really anticipated by the system directly. It's using Unity events, so very open-ended. And also one thing I'll highlight on this slide is that conversations here are assumed to be sequential. So, if this is our first conversation, it starts with this node, we're in this room, and these are the actors that are in it. So this one's just Merlin, the next one's just Guinevere, and then characters will walk on and off the scene, depending on who's in that. And yeah, because it's scriptable objects, you can store copies as drafts. You can reorganize things very easily, all within Unity. And then also the next thing is it uses a ramp structure for as the game develops. And not only that, it's on 3 dimensions. So I use affection, fear, and trust. This is actually another idea taken from some of Chris Crawford's work. And with the idea being that affection is how much a character likes or dislikes you. Fear is like dominance versus submissiveness. And then trust is whether they think you're going to follow through on what you say. You don't have to use these if you're using the system. You can just set the values to 0 and it has no impact. And so yeah, in the scriptable objects for each character, you can set their initial opinions towards each other character. And then, in addition to being able to affect the base values, as you change your relationship with one character, other characters that care about them will then change their opinion of you. And that's also mediated by these empathy values, like how much they care about what other people think about other people. So the end result of that is the choices and effects that you make will have ripple effects on the rest of the characters in the game.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Maybe you're going to bring this up, but right here, well, you just brought it up actually. When you make a decision, you see exactly all of the values that change based off of that decision you made. And what we found was that sort of informs the story a little bit, because when you read that these values have changed, you realize, that gives some clues into who those characters are. So we were doing a sort of a spin on the King Arthur story. The theme of the game jam was roots. So we just made them all root vegetables. And other than that, I mean, it's just a bunch of the King Arthur's.
Yeah, thanks.
This isn't exactly a story point, but as a game mechanic point, this is a distinct difference between a tabletop game and even a implementation of the same game. When you're doing something where you have to perform all the computations yourself and add up your bonuses or whatever, it really keeps reminding you of them, and you start to notice more, oh, I should maybe get that special armor because it's better against the fire demon. But when all that's happening behind the scenes, or if there's too much stuff scrolling across the screen, for good or ill, you can lose track of the mechanics. That might allow you to get more immersed in the story and say, well, I'm going to role play and do what seems like a good idea rather than min-maxing my score.
That's true, but yeah, you could slim it down a little bit, but like you get some clue here. It's buried in there that Mordred is a villain of the game because his fear for you goes up here when you get these other hordes to trust you. Mm-hmm. So we thought, oh well, there's kind of like a little subtle storytelling aspect there in that system.
Yeah, I would say so. This system of just having like a bunch of text things prompts just show up whenever any characters change. A little bit clunky. If it was more than like a 2-week game jam, I would have come up with something you know, easier to view than this. But yes, I agree with Aiden's point. Is something that I kind of noticed as it comes up as from playing it is, so right here you've had this conversation with Kay is the onion, Boris is the potato. And you just had a conversation with them, and so let's see. Kay's fear of Arthur is gone down. Boar's direct fear of Arthur is also gone down. So like the impact of that is pretty clear if you saw the text before this. But then you also start seeing things like I said about Mordred's indirect fear of Arthur has gone up. And Boar's indirect trust for Guinevere has also gone up slightly. And so you can kind of like infer what characters like or dislike or are afraid of, or what the relationships is between characters who aren't on the screen.
What were you defining as the difference between direct and indirect? Hearsay or?
Basically that. So indirect. So let's say a direct is, let's say I'm talking to you and you say something that makes me angry. And so my direct affection for you goes down by 0.1. But then Aiden is friends with me. And so because I'm mad at you, he likes you less also. That would be indirect affection for you goes down by 0.05. Would be a example of that distinction.
You're kind of inferring these relationships happening off screen.
Right. And so if you are seeing this as oh, I know I made, Will angry, so I can see why that went down. But then like Aiden's affection went down also. Okay, that there's that connection between them. If you know that that's how the mechanics work. Okay. So it's that's what that, and also that's something, if you don't want to deal with that, you can just set the empathy values to 0 and there will be no indirect changes. And then in terms of actually using all this stuff, in the Juice of Arthur, there's really just one branch at the each conversation has a set of branches that comes out, but then it converges back to the next conversation. And at the very end, you don't really get any choices as a player. There's this character comes in to assassinate you, and it succeeds or fails. And right here, some of the nodes require relationship thresholds. So right here, this option will be taken if Morgan's fear of Arthur is greater than 0.285. And if it isn't, if any of these 3 fail, and some of them are set to -2 so that you'll automatically pass, then you'll go to this other ending as a fallback node, which is going to be a loss. And then also, if you want something that's a little bit more directly controllable, there's also logical thresholds where has this occasion occurred or not. And the occasions, by the way, are what gonna trigger relational changes. I don't know if I didn't include a slide for specifying what a relational change is for an occasion, but that would be the other thing that was in it. So a couple of lessons learned from this, and yeah, Aiden, you can add in something if there's anything that comes up for you. One is that there are a lot of choices that you need to have in a game like this before the ramp is actually easier than any delayed branching. I'm actually going to make a little light stack. Because with that just logical requirements, you could just specify everything in there. And so where relation is easier is that you don't have to specify like all the things that need to happen for this end result. You can just say, add everything together. If you've passed this threshold, then this thing happens. If not, this other thing happens. And you don't really need to know every possibility. You just, when I was balancing that game, I just played the game, making all the right choices, saw what the end result was, and then put the threshold a little lower than that. And that's really all you need for balancing. If you want to have 3 or 4 choices that work, or 3 or 4 paths that work, just try each of those, make sure the threshold's set to those, and also try playing the game making the worst possible choices and make sure that fails. But you don't have to try every possible combination. And if some combinations work or don't work unexpectedly, maybe that's okay. Too long of a ramp structure starts to get boring. 10 conversations or something like that, that all contribute to something. Okay, you can imagine that building up as long as the player knows what's happening. If there's like hundreds, then it could start to feel a little monotonous, or like you're just reading a book at that point. Whenever there's a lot of complexity going on in a game, like if all that's happening is just selecting choices, if there's a lot of complexity going on behind the scenes that isn't obvious and the player just sees them like reading and clicking boxes, then I would really recommend telling players what's happening. At least if this kind of techniques were commonly used and people assumed there was a lot of complex stuff happening behind the scenes, then that would be one thing. But since most things are just simple branching with convergence, then I would say, like, if you have some complexity, sell that. And then the last point here is that how you structure the medium controls what sort of message you can tell. But ultimately, the hard and real creative part of any fiction, whether it's interactive or not, is the writing aspect of it. Everything else is just structure for the writing to work within. So yeah, lastly, I have a couple of links to, here's the itch page where you can play the Juice of Arthur game, and then also a GitHub page where you can get and I'll share these slides, where you can download the Unity project, see how it all fits together, and build some of your own interactive stories just using those tools. And that's all. Any questions?
Go watch all the talks that you linked to.
Oh, sure.
What do you think about like a like branching interactiveness, but like not so much convergence as just like the through line of the story stays the same, but like where the characters are positioned, or I don't know. I can see it in my head, but I can't really guess at how feasible it would be to build.
I know what you're talking about. You're changing, like having little variables in the output that are generally details that don't like necessarily change everything else. But those are variable depending on what happens. And so you kind of get a different flavor of the end result depending on the choices you've made.
Kind of. More like having I guess it's like plot arcs with fillable slots.
Mm-hmm.
So you have only a small amount of branching for the main path, but the path that you take through that main path can be like, it seems like if you had enough, like say you have all the locations that you're going to go to are the same, but maybe the order that you go to them in, mm-hmm, or the layout of them when you get there could be different. It seems like you could keep the amount of repetitive stuff you have to build down.
Do things change based off your choices, or?
Right, like like whether you choose to let a character die at a certain spot, or do what they want or something, like, so the storyline needs something to happen at a certain point, but it doesn't necessarily care which character causes it to happen or what angle you get to that from.
It's kind of like what happened in Walking Dead, the Telltale games. Where it's all one main story, but there are a few parts where it's like, do I let this person die or this person die? And then that character's, father might have a grudge against you. Like, but it doesn't really affect the overall narrative. But I don't know. Is that kind of what you're talking about or no?
Probably. I haven't played this, but I don't know, I think something like what I felt like Mass Effect was promising and should have been and didn't do.
So I see two ideas mixed together at that. One is making choices that affect the story but don't change its overall shape. And that kind of is really like a compromise position between the basic tension is it's not that there's like you're one or the other. It's that there's a tension or trade-off between choices that matter and limiting the amount of content. And you can go in the middle where you have choices matter a little bit and add a little bit more content. And so it doesn't have to be absolutes. That gets a little tricky, but there have been places that have done that. But in that case, you're kind of giving a little on both sides. Because like either the choice makes a difference in how the story plays out, in which case you have to write out both ways it can play out, or it doesn't, in which case there isn't really a meaningful choice, or if it only changes a little bit, so you don't have to write very much. Now, the other idea that's mixed into that, which actually, this one's very interesting, and I hadn't kind of talked about it obliquely, but I think it's something that merits a lot more attention, is interaction between story and game. So, for example, certain choices that you can make cause one side character to die or live. And the story can go on with them alive or not. And so it's not really a huge plot point whether they're there or not, or it might just change which character is following you versus one says they hate you and runs away, goes away. However, those characters impact how the game plays because they're either your ally or like you have this ally who has great magical abilities, or you have this ally who's more of a berserker or something like that, or no ally and you have to go it on your own. And that affects the game, and then stuff that and maybe things can go the other way as well, where stuff that happens in the game, goes back to the narrative. And so yeah, that is something that I think could bring a lot of value in, is just rather than just having the gameplay and the narrative being these separate things and jumping back and forth, to actually have them inform each other. Because since the gameplay is interactive already and dealing with all the possibilities there, that's kind of a more solved thing. Tying that with the narrative could make each of them stronger, and would be possible. It's just tricky and tied to individual designs for games, rather than something that can be solved like in a really general way.
Right. Yeah.
Are there particular games that are famous for having tackled this problem in an interesting way? I mean, I remember hearing that Mass Effect, there's a point where you make a decision as to whether or not to kill a particular non-player character, and that matters later in the story. And even in the sequel game, you load up your state from the first game. If you kill that character in the first game, they're just not there in the second game.
To an extent, but it never really has all that. They're kind of like side little stories. I'm like, oh, yeah, you did this in the last one. But I was disappointed when I got to the third one. I'm like, oh, branching. Oh.
My reasoning is that everything outpaces the ability to build story for it. Like, we can build bigger worlds, no problem. It's just like time and resources, but like writing all the possible stories to like fill that is like, we're way behind our ability to do that.